Two Old Women by Velma Wallace. Chapter 1. Hunger and cold take their toll. The air stretched tight, quiet, and cold over the vast land. Tall spruce branches hung heavily laden with snow, awaiting distant spring winds. The frosted willows seemed to tremble in the freezing temperatures. Far off in the seemingly dismal land were bands of people dressed in furs and animal skins, huddled close to small campfires. Their weather-burnt faces were stricken with looks, page 2, of hopelessness as they faced starvation, and the future held little promise of better days. These nomads were the people of the Arctic region of Alaska, always on the move in search of food, where the caribou and other migrating animals roamed. The people followed, but the deep cold of winter presented special problems. The moose, their favorite source of food, took refuge from the penetrating cold by staying in one place and were difficult to find. Smaller and more accessible animals, such as rabbits and tree squirrels, could not sustain the large bands such as this one. And during the cold spells, even the smaller animals either disappeared in hiding or were thinned by predators, man and animal alike. So during the unusually bitter chill in the late fall, the land seemed void of life and the cold hovered menacingly. During the cold, hunting required more energy than other times. Thus the hunters were fed first, as it was their skills on which the people depended. Yet with so many to feed, what food they had depleted quickly. Despite their efforts, many of the women and children suffered from malnutrition, and some would die of starvation. In this particular band were two old women cared for by the people for many years. The older woman's name was Chickadaksak, for she reminded her parents of a chickadee bird when she was born, and the other woman's name was Sa, which meant star, because at the time of her birth, her mother had been looking at a fall night sky, concentrating on distant stars to take her mind away from the painful labor contractions. The chief would instruct the younger men to set up shelters for these two old women each time the band arrived at a new campsite, and to provide them with water and food, wood and water. The younger woman pulled the two elder women's possessions from one camp to the next, and in turn the two old women tanned animal skins for those who helped them, and the arrangement worked well. However, the two old women shared a character flaw unusual for people of those times. Constantly they complained of aches and pains, and they carried walking sticks to attest to their handicaps. Surprisingly, the others seemed not to mind, despite having been taught from the days of their childhood that weakness was not tolerated among the inhabitants of the harsh motherland. Yet no one reminded the two women, and they continued to travel with the stronger ones until one fateful day. Page 4. One day, something more than the cold hung in the air as the people gathered around the new flickering fires and listened to the chief. He was a man who stood almost a head taller than the other men, and from the folds of his parka ruff he spoke about the cold, hard days that were to be expected, and what each would have to contribute if they were to survive the winter. Page 5. Then in a loud, clear voice, he made a sudden announcement. The council and I have decided and arrived at a decision. The chief paused as if to find strength in his voice to say the next words. We are going to have to leave the old ones behind. His eyes quickly scanned the crowd for reaction. But the hunger and cold had taken their toll, and the people did not seem to be shocked. Many expected this to happen, and some thought it for the best. In those days, leaving the old ones behind in times of starvation was not an unknown act, although in this band it was happening for the first time. The starkness of the primitive land seemed to demand it, and as the people, to survive, were forced to imitate some of the ways of animals. Like the younger, more able wolves would shun the old leader of the pack, these people would leave the old ones behind so that they could move faster without extra burdens. The older woman, Chikadaksak, had a daughter and a grandson among the group. The chief looked at the crowd for them and saw that they too had shown no reaction. Greatly relieved, an unpleasant announcement had to be made without incident. The chief instructed everyone to pack up immediately. Meanwhile, this brave man who was their leader could not bring himself to look at the two old women, for he did not feel so strong now. The chief understood why the people who had cared for the old women did not raise objections. In these hard times, many of the men came frustrated and were easily angered when one wrong thing was said or done and could cause an uproar to make matters worse. So it was the weak and the beaten members of the tribe that were kept at dismay. They felt to themselves, for they knew that the cold could bring on a wave of panic followed by cruelty and brutality among the people fighting for survival. In the many years the women had been with the band, the chief had begun to feel affection for them. Now he wanted to be away as quick as possible so that the two old women could not look at him and make him feel worse than he had ever felt in his life. The two old women sat in a small before the campfire with their chins held up proudly, disguising their shock. In the younger days, they had seen the old people left behind, but they had never expected such a fate. They stared ahead numbly as if they had not heard the chief condemn them to a certain death, not to be left alone to fend for themselves in a land that understood that only strength. Two weak old women stood no chance against the rule. The news left them without words or action, no way to defend themselves. Of the two, Chikadaksak was the one with family, a daughter, Ozili Nili, and grandson, Shurzu. But she waited for her daughter to protest, but none came, and a deeper sense of shock overcame her. Not even her own daughter would try to protect her. Next to her, Sao also was stunned. Her mind reeled and thought out, and she wanted to cry out. No words came. She felt as if a terrible nightmare where she could neither move nor speak. As the band trudged slowly away, Chikadaksa's daughter bent over her mother, carrying a bundle of bibachi, quickly stripped raw moose hide that served many purposes. She hung her head in grief and shame, for her mother refused to acknowledge her presence. Instead, Chikadaksa stared unflinchingly ahead. Ozi Nili was in deep turmoil. She feared that if she defended her mother, the people might settle the matter by leaving her behind and her son too. Worse yet, in a famished state, they might do something even more terrible, and she could not chance it. With those frightening thoughts, Ozi Nili silently begged with sorrowful eyes to be forgiven, and understandingly she gently laid the bibachi down in front of the rigid parent. Then she slowly turned and walked away with a heaviness in her heart, knowing she had just lost her mother. The grandson, Shurzu, was deeply disturbed by the cruelty. He was an unusual boy. While the other boys competed for manhood by hunting and wrestling, this was one content to help provide for his mother and the two old women. His behavior seemed to be outside the structure of the band's organization, handed down from generation to generation. In this case, the women did most of the burdensome tasks, such as pulling in well-packed toboggans. In addition, much of the time-consuming work was expected to be done by the women while the men concentrated on hunting so the band could survive. No one complained, for that was the way things were and had always been. Shirzu had much respect for the women. He saw how they were treated and he disapproved. And while he was explaining to himself over and over that he understood why the men did not help the women, but his training told him that he was never to question the ways of the people, for that would be disrespectful. When he was younger, Shirzu was not afraid to voice his opinions on subjects, for youth and innocence were his guardians. Later, he learned that such behavior invited punishment. He felt in the pain of the silent treatment, even when his mother refused to speak to him for days. So Shirzu learned that it caused less pain to think about certain things rather than to speak out about them. Although the thought of abandoning the helpless old women was the worst thing the people could do, Shirzu was struggling with himself. His mother saw the turmoil raging in his eyes, and she knew that he was close to protesting. She went to him quickly and whispered urgently in his ear, not thinking of it, for the men were desperate enough to commit any kind of cruel action. Shirzu also saw the dark men's faces and knew that that was true, so he held his tongue, even though in his heart he continued to rage rebelliously. In those days, each young boy was trained to care for his weapons, sometimes better than he cared for his loved ones, for the weapons were to be his livelihood when he became a man. When a boy taught handling his weapon the wrong way or was for the wrong purpose, it resulted in a harsh punishment. And as he grew older, the boy would learn his power of his weapon and how much significance it had, not only for his own survival, but for the survival of the people. Shirzu threw out all his training and thought of his own safety to the winds. He took from his belt his hatchet made of sharpened animal bones, bound together tightly with hardened babachi, and steadily placed it in a high, thick boughs of the branchy young spruce, well concealed from the eyes of the people. As Shirzu's mother packed their things, he turned towards his grandmother. Though she seemed to look right through him, Shirzu made sure no one was watching when he pointed to the empty belt and then toward the spruce tree. Once more he gave his grandmother a look of hopelessness and reluctantly turned away and walked away to join the others, wishing with a sinking feeling that he could do something miraculous and end this nightmarish day. The large band of famished people slowly moved away, leaving two women sitting in the same stunned position on their piled spruce boughs. Their small fire cast an orange glow onto the weathered faces. A long time passed before the cold brought Chiksu out of her stupor. She was aware of her daughter's helpless gesture, but believed that her only child should have defended her even in the face of danger. The old woman's heart softened as she thought of her grandson. How could she bear hard feelings towards one so young and gentle? The others made her angry, especially her daughter. Had she not trained her to be strong? Hot, unbidden tears ran from her eyes. At that moment, Saw lifted her head in time to see her friend's tears, and a rush anger surged within her. How dare they? Her cheeks burned with humiliation. She and the other old women were not close to dying. Had they not sewn and tanned for the people had given them? Did they not have to be carried from camp to camp? They were neither helpless nor hopeless, yet they had been condemned to die. Her friend had seen 80 summers, and she had seen 75. The old ones that she had seen left behind when she was younger were closer to death, and some were blind and they couldn't even walk. Now here she was, able to walk and see and talk and blah. Younger people these days look for easier ways out of hard times. As the cold air smothered the campfire, Sa came alive with greater fire, and her almost the spirit absorbing the fire from the glow of the embers of the campfire. She went to the tree and retrieved the hatchet, smiling softly as she thought of her friend's grandson. She sighed as she walked towards her companion, who had not stirred. Sa looked up at the blue sky. To experienced eye, the blue was a time of winter that meant cold. Soon it would be colder, yet, after the night approached, With a worried frown on her face, Sa kneeled beside her friend and spoke in a gentle but firm voice. "My friend," she said, and paused, hoping that strength that she felt. "We can sit here and wait to die. We will not have a long wait. Our time of leaving this world should not come for a long time," she added quickly, when her friend looked up, panic-stricken. "But we will die if we just sit here and wait. This would prove them right about our helplessness." Chagdaksa listened with despair. Knowing that her friend was dangerously close to accepting her fate from cold and hunger, Sa spoke more urgently. "Yes, in their own way, they have condemned us to die. They think that we are too old and useless. Yet they forget that we have earned the right to live. So I say, if we're going to die, my friend, let us die trying, not sitting." End of chapter 1.